Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, coming at you with another top 5 deck list. This time things will be a little bit different, but as a friendly reminder, if you do like Pioneer-based content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, especially let us know what might be the top 5 decks in the format, and what other decks you might like to see us cover, either matchup videos or deck guides compared to what we've already done. So the top 5 is a little bit weird because they've kind of started to form a bit of a cycle. Now there's no one deck in the format that is so powerful that nothing can stand up to it, or that just only has like one bad matchup in the format. Winona, I think, was the last deck that kind of qualified as that, where only 1 or 2 decks were really good against it and the rest of the format was just a complete dog. The rest of the format is kind of taken on this dynamic of kind of like this cyclical nature, and it kind of starts with these top 4, the 4 key decks, and the 5th one that we'll talk about a little bit, which kind of coincides with one of the other top decks in the format. Blue-White Control is what a lot of people would consider the number 1 deck in the format right now, based on last weekend's results. I don't know whether it's the top deck in the format or not, and I don't really think it's the deck that the format revolves around, but I do think it is one of the top 4 decks in the format. Blue-White obviously tends to play well into known metagames. Tends to do well when it knows what it's attacking, gets the tools that it needs to do, and attacks those tools. Blue-White happens to be quite good into 2 of our other decks in the top 5, which happen to be Red-Black Midrange and Is It Phoenix. It often has the tools to compete with both of those, especially, as it gets more condensed, it tends to be better against the linear decks, decks like Mono Green, the aggressive decks, and as it does the 80 card version, tends to be a little bit better against the more mid-range and go over the top strategies. So Blue-White can often be built to beat most of anything, though it does tend to struggle with the very linear aggressive decks overall, and can sometimes struggle with decks that are tuned to beat it. It has an okay matchup against Mono Green, which is probably what I would consider the linchpin of the format. But your answers have to line up perfectly with what they're doing. You have to bring in things like Ether Gust and stuff to answer their specific threats, etc. Red-Black, game 1, you're kind of favored. Game 2 and game 3, a lot of it depends on what Red-Black has access to. They can overwhelm you with discard spells, creature threats, and planeswalkers combined. And one of the things Blue-White is not particularly good at, and why a lot of people tend to go to Esper when mid-range is more of a thing, is because Blue-White doesn't always have the perfect tools to answer all these different miscellaneous threats, and things like Void Run and stuff give you a little bit more flexibility in those tools. That said, I do think this is one of the top 4 decks in the format, and something you need to be aware of. Like I said, it tends to be a little bit favored against Red-Black, specifically because it's so far ahead in game number 1. And Is It Phoenix, it can have decent tools against, especially with Narsets in the board and such. Rest in Peace to kind of shut down a lot of what it's doing. It can have a very good post-board match against Blue-Red Phoenix. And then, Mono Green, kind of hit or miss. Some people say it's 50-50. Some people say Mono Green's a little bit ahead. I would tend to say Mono Green is the deck asking the questions. Blue-White Control has to have the perfect answers, and if they don't happen to line up, Blue-White can be a little bit behind. And then, if you start getting into hyper-aggressive decks in the format, Blue-White can kind of get a little bit overwhelmed trying to answer all these different things. So that's why it's one of those decks that you have to be very mindful of the meta you play in, and it's very much a deck that favors those who can tune a deck towards a specific meta. The deck that I would consider the linchpin of the format is Mono Green and all of its variants. You have the Mono Green variant, which was the most common for a while. Then you have this Mono Green splashing nickel Bolas version, and now there's this Mono Green splashing black that has access to like Vraska Golgari Queen, and just it plays a little bit more of a mid-range game. I don't know how that one shakes out, as I've only seen it pop up every now and again. The Bolas version I've been seeing more and more of. You might question how you're casting Nicol Bolas in a 4-color or a mono green deck, essentially. The main key answers are Oath of Nissa, allowing you to cast Planeswalkers for any mana of any color, Storm the Festival, hitting it off of that. Beyond that, Nick EB is basically uncastable in the deck, but that does give you enough ways to do it. Number 1, it's an alternative win con. Number 2, it's a removal spell in the main deck, which this deck is sorely lacking unless they're playing Hydras in the main deck. And overall, it's just a nice tool to add to the thing without really giving up too much of the cost. Basically, you're giving up some of the slots of, maybe one of the slots that was on Nissa. Maybe you're giving up one of the ramp acceleration slots just to fit a couple of things in the deck that are perfectly fine. You still get Karn's utility. You still get all the other things. And Mono Green, when I say it's a linchpin in the format, I think as Mono Green increases in the format, Red-Black tends to decrease. and then a lot of the decks kind of play off of that dynamic. As I said, blue-white has an okay-ish matchup against it. Izzet Phoenix, especially with their quick Thing in the Ice or Ledger Shredder draws, and as well as their combo finish, can have a decent game against it. Although that matchup is also fairly close. I think the longer the game goes, the more it probably favors mono green, especially if the Izzet Phoenix deck isn't getting enough traction and not threatening early enough. Mono green will take over in the mid to late game. And so when I say this is the linchpin in the format, this is kind of what I mean. And the number 5 deck that we're going to be talking about is directly related to this deck in terms of its performance as well. So the third deck we're going to talk about as far as the top 4 decks in the format is Rakdos Midrange. Now this is a deck that can obviously be built very easily to compete with blue-white control, with all the aggressive decks running around. Can have the right tools to play against Izzet Phoenix, although it definitely has to be the aggressor, as it's not going to beat multiple resolve treasure cruises in the mid to late game, so this is kind of the deck. You might have the right tools to shut them down, but against blue-white control and Izzet Phoenix, you both have to close the game very quickly, or else you run into the problem of those decks kind of taking over in the mid to late game, as they have a lot more haymakers than you do. I mean, yes, you have things like Chandra and Goblin Dark Dwellers. In the sideboard, sometimes you'll see Chandra Awakened Inferno or more copies of Dark Dwellers. But overall, these are definitely decks that wants to get the game over in the mid game. You don't want to go long against Phoenix and blue-white control. That said, its matchup against mono green tends to be quite bad. You can do some things like Lifebane Zombie and tailoring your removal spells like Epic Downfall and such to kind of help in those matchups. But overall, it's a little bit of a rough matchup overall. It's a deck that plays all the good cards, but doesn't really have a ton of 2-for-1s outside, things like Bone Crusher Giant, Fable of the Mirror Breaker and stuff, and just the 2-for-1s you get with those and kind of the classic rock strategy that red-black is. It's going to have weaknesses against decks that go over the top of it. That said, it plays very well into aggression decks. Tends to feast. Tends to do fairly well against the humans variants, although humans can grind with it. Tends to do well against the Spirience variants. Tends to do well against mono red, at least the non-Ember Cleave Annex version of the deck with Hazarets and such. It tends to be very well against the creature-centric decks. Tends to be decent in the other mid-range nears, especially against Phoenix. And, tends to struggle against decks that go over the top of it, especially blue-white control in game number 1. Mono green overall is a fairly terrible matchup, although a good red-black pilot can manage to get some percentage points there. And then finally, deck number 4. Deck number 4 is Izzet Phoenix. Deck that took the banning of Expressive Iteration, just keeps on ticking. It gets to play all these Delve spells like Treasure Cruise and Temporal Mastery. Gets to use things like Arc-Light Phoenix to get even more value from its graveyard. And then, uses things like strategic playing pieces of the puzzle to fill its graveyard up. And then, basically it's a Ledger Shredder Thing in the Ice deck. You get to pressure your opponent with Ledger Shredders. You get to, return your opponent's creatures back to their hand with Thing in the Ice and pressure their planeswalkers or life total. It's overall a deck that sees a lot of churning and such, and is a deck that is especially well set up against most aggressive based decks. Between Lightning Axe and Fire Impulse and any other red based removal, you tend to be quite well in those matchups. So against decks like Spirits and Humans. I know from playing in Modern that Thing in the Ice was always particularly good against the Humans decks, completely resetting 2 or 3 turns worth of their thing, especially in the early game. And overall this deck, much like Red-Black, fairly well set up against the aggressive decks, although it can struggle a little bit against the Cleave version of Mono Red a little bit, because that version tends to hit a little bit harder. But, there's really not any decks that go underneath of it terribly much. That said, it kind of has a 50-50-ish matchup against mono green and kind of a close-ish matchup against blue-white control, although blue-white's probably a little bit favored depending on their build. This is a deck that does perform quite well in the meta, has a very good match spread, but is a deck you have to have some experience with a little bit as learning the sequencing of stuff, get what is the priority in the matchup, etc. But you have a deck with recurring creatures, overwhelming card advantage in the middle late game with Treasure Cruise, and a deck with a combo finish with Galvanic Iteration and Temporal Trespass. A deck that has a lot to like about it, although it is a little bit vulnerable to graveyard hate and does take a little bit of time to set up sometimes, so sometimes it can get caught off guard with things like the Auras decks if they're protecting their creatures. Heroic can get under it sometimes, although they're probably favored in both of those. They're probably favored against Heroic, not so much against Auras, but, this is a deck that does take a little bit of time to set up and can get overpowered by certain decks like Mono Green and Blue-White Control going in the mid to late game, though it does have late game with Treasure Cruise and Temporal Mastery. The fifth deck we'll talk about is kind of replaced mono blue as the chief hunter of mono green, and that is red white heroic. Red white heroic is a deck that's trying to pair prowess and heroic creatures along with, Illuminator, Virtuoso, and 10-3 District Legionnaire, which are basically heroic creatures in terms of how they're templated. Although Illuminator, obviously, it does connive. 10th District Legionnaire is anytime it's targeted, so much like Favored Hoplite, it is basically the heroic effect. And then you pair it with things like Monastery Swift Spear. Sometimes it plays copies of Sour Patch Kids. Soulscar Mage as well, just as additional threats. And overall, this is a deck that's just A plus B combo deck, trying to play a bunch of pump spells, trying to play some protection spells, getting your opponent dead as quickly as possible. Tends to thrive against decks that are a little bit linear. Decks that are interactive, like Izzet Phoenix and Red Black, can be a little bit difficult. A deck like Mono Green, where it's trying to race what you're doing, this deck is quite good at that and actually kind of beats Mono Green to the punch. And Blue White Control, sometimes they're a little bit slower and their removal is a little bit more conditional than Red Black and Izzet Phoenix. They don't have that one cost Fatal Push or Fiery Impulse. Yes, they have Portable Hold, but Portable Hold's a lot easier to play around. This deck can play decently into Blue White Control. Tends to be very good against Mono Green, so its stock literally tends to rise as Mono Green rises, and as Rakdos tends to rise in the meta, this deck tends to fall. So literally, its fate is kind of tied with Mono Green, that as Mono Green's rising up and kind of pushing Red Black out, this deck's rising immediate, and then Red Black and Izzet kind of rise back up to take out Heroic after Heroic's putting a dent in some of Mono Green's numbers, and it's just kind of this vicious cycle. I will say that this is the most dependent on outside decks deck in terms of what's going on with the format. I would really still say the other four are the kind of the top tier of the format. The Mono Green variants, the Blue White Control variants, the Izzet Phoenix, and the Red Black. I would say those are the top tier of the format, and then Heroic is the start of the tier below. The tier with like humans and spirits and these different other decks that you'll see like Lotus Field and such. Decks that can pop up and certainly do well, but the top four I think are certainly kind of fine-tuned and are starting to really get crafted, and Heroic has kind of risen as this deck that can have a decent fight against Blue White and have a very good game against Mono Green, and has a fighting chance against the removal heavy decks, although it's definitely a dog. Although you can definitely see in the post-board games, with access to things like Adonto Vanguard and Showdown of the Skulls, you can definitely tell that this is a uphill struggle for them in the grinding matchups. And one other deck to note, it's not in the top 5 right now, but a deck that can certainly potentially get there is Abzan Greasefang. It's very reminiscent of the old Abzan Reanimator decks in the RTR Innistrad format. For those of you who are playing then, it's a deck that's very much, it's a combo deck, but also has some value to it. It can play a decent mid-range game. Even if the graveyard gets shut off, it still has a Seeka's Chariots, sometimes running Regisaurs. They can kind of play this mid-range game, and it's certainly the deck to watch in the format. As far as what I'd rate the decks, I would say Boros Heroic's probably number 5. I would probably say Izzet Phoenix is probably number 4. And then, from week to week it varies whether Mono Green, Rakdos, or Blue White. Most people would say Blue White's number 1, probably Mono Green number 2, and Rakdos number 3. So, I would really say those top 4 are really kind of the cornerstone of the format, and then the decks around it, just based on different things. Whether when Mono Green's rising, obviously a deck like Lotus Field's going to struggle, because Karn is such a beating for that deck. So a lot of the decks are kind of interdependent, and I would say Mono Green is definitely the linchpin in the format, whether you would say that's worthy of the number 1 spot or not. But I would say a lot of the format tends to revolve around how its matchup for Mono Green goes, and kind of the playoff from there. So, as a friendly reminder, if you do like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and constructive comment down below, and let us know what your top 5 decks in the format are right now.